things to know about this distinguished Nigerian. He has had several academic experiences as a professor of history, the University of Lagos, visiting professor in the Department of History, University of Ibadan. Amidst several administrative experiences, which include, are not limited to, member Presidential Advisory Council on International Relations, Director, Nigerian Universities Commission Office at the Washington, D.C., United States of America, Director, Nigerian University Commission Office in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. He has several honors and awards, about 18 of them. He's an OON, an officer, Order of the Niger, conferred on him 13 years ago, 2004. He is a fellow of the Nigerian Academy of Letters, 2007. In the world of academics, he has contributions in not less than 11 chapters in different books. And he is a member of the Society of International Affairs, member Historical Society of Nigeria. Today, I present to you our guest lecturer for today, Professor Akinjide Oladipo Idowu Oshutukun, Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations, and the Bar Piton of Oyo, that is the Chief Historian of Oyo. Thank you.
Excellency, the wife of the Vice President, Mrs. Dolapo Oshibaki, the representative of the Speaker, the former governor of Ondo State, Olusegun Rahmat Nimibo, members of the two houses of Parliament, leaders of the church, you will permit me to be personal in the introduction or in the acknowledgement of the presence of a few people here. I acknowledge my old friends, Dr. and Mrs. Vincent Sagwa, who are together in Maiduguri in the good old days. I also acknowledge Pastor Wigwe, who as a young army captain after independence served with one of my late brothers in the Army Engineering Corps. I also want to acknowledge the presence of an academic colleague, Professor Femi Odekunle. Odekunle and I share a lot in common, in the sense that apart from having been involved in the public affairs of this country for years, we also suffered incarceration for having views that were contrary to the views of those people in power at a particular time. So Femi, I acknowledge you, and I'm happy you and I are still alive. I acknowledge all the great leaders who are here, my Lords temporal and spiritual, the representative of the IG. I have a list of protocol and recognition, but you will kindly permit me to acknowledge everybody as being very important. I want to pass on a message to our daddy in the Lord, Pastor Adeboye, who I consider as a spiritual father and as a friend. We were both in the University of Lagos, and when he was less busy and much younger than now, I used to visit him in his house casually, and he also used to visit me in my house. But things are a little bit different because of the complexity of the church today. I send him fraternal greetings, and I wish him many, many, many more years of excellent service to this country. It is a great honor that I've been called upon to give this lecture in celebration of the 76th anniversary of Pastor Adeboye. One thing one can say without fear of contradiction is that there is a decline in political leadership all over the world. The emergence of Donald J. Trump as the president of the USA, the richest and most powerful country in the world, is an illustration of this decline in political leadership in the world. A cursory look at the leaders of the world in recent times would put in bold relief the decline of political leadership in the world. When I was growing up, and some of you know me and who know the Oshintokun clan will know that I've lived all my life in a political environment. When I was growing up, the global firmament of political leadership was dominated by people like General David Dwight Eisenhower, who was President of the United States of America from 1953 to 1961, after having been Allied Commander-in-Chief of the armies that finally vanquished Nazi Germany in 1945. He was followed by John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was president from 1961 to 1963 when he was assassinated. He had been commander of a gunboat in the war against the Japanese in the Second World War, during which time he suffered a debilitating injury with which he had to live with for the rest of his life. Kennedy demonstrated what the French called noblesse oblige, that is, the responsibility of a nobleman to the less privileged. He then became a senator representing the state of Massachusetts after the war. Another distinguished leader of our times was Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, statesman, army officer, and writer and Nobel laureate for literature. He was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945, and from 1951 to 1955. He demonstrated bulldog tenacity in mobilizing the British people in their titanic struggle against Germany, particularly during the War of Britain of 1941, when Britain locked horns with Germany in the area warfare between the Luftwaffe and the British Air Force. On the opposite ideological spectrum was Clement Attlee, who was Prime Minister from 1945 to 1951 and was responsible for introducing the social welfare state in Great Britain. He was followed by Maurice Harold Macmillan, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1957 to 63. And he was famous for saying there was a wind of change blowing through the continent of Africa, and he was largely responsible for the policy of decolonization of the African continent. James Harold Wilson, who followed Macmillan, was Prime Minister from 1964 to 1970, and from 1974 to 76. He confronted the problem of what to do with white settlers in Southern Africa, and his support for Nigeria was critical to his survival during the Nigerian Civil War. On the same continent of Europe, you had people like General Charles de Gaulle, who bestrode France like a colossus and was president of France from 1958 to 1969. He took the decisive step of decolonization of war-torn Algeria with his 3 million French settlers at almost the cost of his life. He stabilized the notoriously fractious French men who, according to him, if 2 French men were locked up in a room to form a political party, they would come up with 3. He expressed his frustration by saying how daunting it was to have political stability in a country with 28 different types of cheese. The western half of the great German nation was brought into global economic and political reckoning under Konrad Adenauer, who was chancellor between 1949 and 1963. Adenauer and de Gaulle succeeded in building a long-lasting political friendship or accommodation between 2 bitterest enemies who in less than 100 years fought 3 wars, 2 of which brought the whole of the world into mutual slaughter. These great nations, under far-sighted leaders, constituted the Western alliance of capitalist economies protected by its military wing of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The point I'm trying to make is that leadership is very crucial to nation building. Not only to nation building, but to stability and continuity within nations. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, the USSR, the second world power in a divided world between American-dominated Western alliance of NATO and the Russian-dominated Warsaw Pact, was led by Joseph Stalin from the 1920s to 1953. By indescribable brutal force, he mobilized the peasants of the Soviet Union to build a country and an army that successfully resisted the more technologically advanced German forces during the Second World War, and by willpower moved an essentially agrarian country into one of the most technologically advanced countries the world has ever seen. He was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev as first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1964, and Georgy Malenkov as premier of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev later consolidated all powers in his hands and held his own against the Western Alliance and helped consolidate the hold of communism on Eastern Europe. China of my youth was not the economic superpower that it is today, but the signs of what to come were evident in the fact that a country of over 1 billion people could not be kept indefinitely. The Prime Minister of China in 1956, his name was Chu Enlai, said if it was possible for the 1.3 billion Chinese to jump from a height of 10 feet to the same spot, that it will precipitate an earthquake that will shake the whole world. That is the importance of leadership in China. The country of China was ruled by Mao Zedong, poet, political theorist, and founding father of the People's Republic of China. Mao successfully fought against the domination of Hideki Tojo, the wartime Prime Minister of Japan, and also beat the challenge of the Kuomintang of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, a party that was largely in control of China from 1927 to 1948, before Mao Zedong drove it into the island of Taiwan. Mao was assisted by Zhou Enlai as first premier of the People's Republic until he died in 1976. Although China was not a member of the Warsaw Pact nor a member of Comecon, the organization that linked the economies of the communist countries of Eastern Europe with that of the USSR, China nevertheless maintained fraternal proletarian relations with the USSR. India, the other demographic giant in the world, was led by Jawaharlal Nehru, who was premier from 1947 to 1964. Nehru also represented moral leadership and non-alignment in a bitterly divided world. The idea behind this movement of positive neutrality was that they would not automatically support any of the two bipolar alliances, but would decide on principle of what was right in any dispute that arise to face the global community. Other leaders of this group included the then Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was in power from 1956 to 1970, after leading a coup d'etat that overthrew the decadent Egyptian monarchy. Nasser was largely responsible for the rise of Arab nationalism, particularly against the humiliation of the Arab nation following the creation and declaration of independence in Israel in 1947, an expulsion of millions of Arab Palestinians from their land. Among other leaders of this non-aligned movement was Josip Broz Tito of defunct Yugoslavia, who in 1963 was made life president of the Republic until in 1980 when he died. Coming nearer home, Kwame Nkrumah, who headed the government of Ghana from 1951 to 1966, and who was the linchpin for black African nationalism in the 1950s and 1960s, was a member. And there was also Ahmed Sukarno, who ruled Indonesia from 1945 to 1967. Sukarno was responsible for knitting together a country of 2,500 islands into a viable nation, as well as making the most populous Muslim country embrace a liberal form of Islam. Other leaders on the African continent who made an impression on the world and our world in Africa were Ahmed Sékou Touré. He was president of Guinea from 1958 to 1984 when he died. Ahmed Sékou Touré damned the consequence of withdrawing from the French neo-colonial community in 1958, and his country suffered frontal humiliation and attack from France under General Charles de Gaulle, who stripped the country of everything, including furniture, to teach Sékou Touré a hard lesson. Ahmed Sékou Touré, however, stood his grounds and resisted the French and became an icon of African nationalism. Another titan of the African nationalist struggle was Jomo Kenyatta Kenyatta, who was president of Kenya from 1964 to 1974, after the Mau Mau uprising, when his ethnic group, the Kikuyu, rose against Britain's expropriation of their land for white settlers. He was the only man who could bring peace to Kenya and help the country along a constitutional transition. Unfortunately, history is repeating itself in Kenya today with the son of Kenyatta and the son of Odinga Oginga at each other's throats. Other Africans who, by force of character and leadership, provided rallying figures for their embryonic nations in countries where there were white settlers in East and Central Africa were Nwalimu Julius Nyerere, who from 1964 to 85 was president of first Tanganyika and later Tanzania after merger with Zanzibar. And there was also Kenneth David Kaunda, who from 1964 up to 1991 was leader of his country. Closer home to us here in Nigeria, we had the triumvirate of Ahmadu Bello, Obafemi Awolowo, and Nnamdi Azikiwe. And at the federal level, the genial and quiet Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. These four shaped, I hope some of you know that our distinguished wife of the vice president is a granddaughter of Chief Obafemi Awolowo. These four shaped the course of political development in Nigeria. They resolved the debate between those like Nnamdi Azikiwe, who favored a unitary form of government and felt our ethnic and religious differences could be easily overcome, and those like Obafemi Awolowo and Ahmadu Bello, who felt in their own different ways that it was necessary to understand our people's differences and not to forget them, and that a confederal architecture was necessary to keep us together. I remember that in a private discussion, President Olusegun Obasanjo, who was at that time the sitting president of Nigeria, bemoaned the fact that there was a decline in the quality of political leadership in the world. I cannot but agree with him. I have mentioned in the previous paragraphs that leaders were totally committed to their countries and were prepared to sacrifice all that mattered to them, including their lives, to advance the causes of their countries. What they did for their countries was almost self-evident in the transformative impact of their deeds on their countries. Eisenhower was Allied commander of the forces that ended the inhumanity of man to man, as epitomized by Nazi regime, which during the Holocaust against the Jews industrially murdered 6 million of them in Europe as part of Adolf Hitler's final solution to the so-called Jewish problem. One may not applaud Eisenhower's domestic politics in the United States, but there is no doubt in my mind that he was a transitional figure of the tumultuous changes associated with John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson that brought the black population into the democratic mainstream of American politics. J.F. Kennedy, the then youngest president of the USA, fired the imagination of all Americans when he challenged his nation to think what they could do for America and not what America could do for them. This is an immortal concept that many countries have employed to challenge the patriotic sense of their own people. Without wasting Churchill's bulldog tenacity, fiery oration, and leadership during the critical war of Britain, the country could conceivably have collapsed and surrendered to Nazi Germany, just like France did. Clement Attlee perhaps saved Britain from revolution by imposing socialism from above through his introduction of the social welfare state on post-Second World War Britain. Harold Macmillan, by conceding independence to African countries in the 1960s, prevented the wind of change in Africa becoming an hurricane. Harold Wilson, a professor of politics, brought Cartesian analysis to solve the problem of white settlerism in southern Rhodesia. The role of General de Gaulle in the revival and regeneration of France, which lay prostrate under Nazi jackbooks during the Second World War, cannot be overemphasized. He led his country through the tumultuous 1960s until students' rebellion forced him to angrily retire to his village at Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, where he died subsequently. I was in France during this particular crisis. Konrad Adenauer in West Germany was largely responsible for rebuilding Germany, which was virtually leveled down with air and land operations that forced it to surrender in 1945. Stalin and his fellow communists built their country from the scratch. He industrialized it and resisted successfully Nazi Germany and made the USSR a global power in the 20th century. Japan, after surrendering following the dropping of atomic bombs by America on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the humiliation of American occupation, was rebuilt by the same country and the genius of his people after the Korean War. The Japanese Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda, building on the economic foundation laid by Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, who was Prime Minister from 1946 to 1947 and from 1948 to 1954, put up a program between 1960 and 1964 as Prime Minister and decided to double the income of all Japanese within 10 years. This was largely responsible for the economic wonder which Germans call Wirtschaftswunder of Japan within a short period. The same is true of the nation-building efforts of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. The developing countries, sometimes referred to as the Third World, had different challenges from those of the super and putative global powers. India, the largest democracy in the world, faced with the problem of poverty and development, needed somebody of the moral stature of Jawaharlal Nehru to provide the leadership needed for tackling the myriads of complex problems facing this country. The problem of reconstruction in war-devastated Yugoslavia was ably handled by President Tito, who knitted together a country of ethnic incompatibles. The same was true of Ahmed Sukarno. The same was true of Nasser. The same was true of Kwame Nkrumah. The same was true of Kenyatta and Kaunda. What was needed in all this was the sense of self-sacrifice, dedication, and commitment demonstrated by leaders around which the people could rally. Kwame Nkrumah irreverently used to say, "Give us the political kingdom, and all else will be added unto us." This is understandable in a situation of colonial domination when Africans were the butt of all kinds of disparaging remarks about their congenital incapacity to do things for themselves without the aid and assistance of the white man. In such a scenario, the political kingdom of self-determination and independence was crucial. But there was the handicap that unlike European nations, where nations largely existed within boundaries that were coterminous with national or ethnic boundaries, African countries suffered from ethnic and religious divisions that compelled them to rely on strong political leadership, which sometimes led to political dictatorship. Coming nearer home, in Nigeria, nation building had to be on series of building blocks in the absence of a sense of common nationality. The three large nationalities of the Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba largely felt they had different destinies, which could be harmonized within a federal political architecture. Nnamdi Azikiwe, as I've said before, preferred a unitary form of government. He apparently felt the deep ethnic division could be overcome with a forced unitary system of government. This aroused the suspicion of Obafemi Awolowo, who was Premier of Western Nigeria from 1954 to 1959, leader of the opposition at the Federal Parliament from 1959 to 1963, Commissioner of Finance and Vice Chairman of the Federal Executive Council, 1967 to 1970. Awolowo was the most ardent supporter of federalism in Nigeria, having said that Nigeria was a mere geographical expression and that there was not a Nigerian nation as was a German or French nation, and that the idea of Nigerian nation was an illusion, and that the only way Nigeria can be kept together was by allowing each group to develop at its own pace and space. He had enunciated these ideas in a book titled Path to Nigerian Freedom, published in 1947 in London. It was somehow vicariously supported by Ahmadu Bello, who was Premier of Northern Nigeria between 1954 and 1966. Ahmadu Bello was a scion of the Fulani ruling house of Usman Dan Fodio, who had a sense of entitlement and who believed he was born to rule. His political idea was based on conservatism and realism in a situation where his people lacked the educational power to contest equally with their southern Nigeria compatriots. This triumvirate with different political philosophies about governance led Nigeria to independence under a federal system of government, with a figurehead Prime Minister, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, from 1957 to 1966. In their different ways, they tended to consolidate powers in their own hands and hardly tolerated dissent, and this led to disastrous consequences of party divisions, which opened the doors for non-democratic intervention in politics. However, through expansion of educational opportunities, starting from Western Nigeria, great strides in literacy and Western education were recorded. This made social mobilization easier, but it did not necessarily lead to liberal democracy. The role of the big man, rather than institutions, pervaded national and subnational politics in most of Africa and the developing world. This has led to the criticism that instead of Africans building structures and institutions, they put their political destinies in the hands of strong men rather than strong institutions. This concentration of power in one or a few hands has led to political instability and military intervention and martial law and dictatorship and widespread corruption and impoverishment of the masses and consequent underdevelopment. The impact of this phenomenon is the most serious when it is realized that there was little foreign investment and most of the states copying the socialist paradigm of 5-year development programs were operating command centrally planned economies with direct state economic intervention. This lent itself to mismanagement and financial corruption. This corporatist approach to development contributed to economic backwardness of most countries in the developing world until they opened themselves up to private investment and embraced market economies and liberal economic development of recent provenance. The superficial embrace of democracy by African leaders and pervasive corruption exposed Africa and other third world countries to non-democratic intervention in their politics by the military, which for years became the alternative to political leadership. This phenomenon of non-democratic intervention of the military in governance was not witnessed by African countries south of the Sahara alone, but by countries such as Burma, Pakistan, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Algeria. Only the Kingdom of Morocco was an exception in the Maghreb. Outside Africa, the same tendencies have manifested itself in Greece, in Spain, in Turkey, in Europe, and most of South American countries the most important of which are Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, and others. In other words, non-democratic tendencies in governance appear to be synonymous with underdevelopment. To get out of this sad state calls for sterling leadership. This has been the challenge of most poor countries, and those countries that have successfully faced the problem and appear to be coming out of it provides a useful paradigm which needs to be studied. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the fragility of the successor states to the disintegrated colonial empires of France, Britain, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands in Africa, in Latin America, and Asia made the quality of political leadership critical to peace and development. The British Raj in India over time split into three: India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Malaysia has split into Singapore and Malaysia. Ethiopia has split into Ethiopia and Eritrea. Sudan into Southern Sudan and Sudan. Somalia into Somalia and Somaliland. Guinea, Cape Verde into Bissau and Cape Verde. And Nigeria barely managed to hold on together after a disastrous war between 1967 and 1970. What is noticeably responsible for these vociferous tendencies was the failure of leadership. Where leadership had foresight, as in defunct Yugoslavia, India, and Indonesia, complex societies have been kept together in spite of ethnic, racial, and religious differences. One thing that is clear is that political stability is a sine qua non for economic development. Political freedom is the easier task in leadership, while economic development is a long-distance race that cannot be accomplished in one generation. But a beginning must be made so that coming generations can climb on the shoulders of those before them. There is no doubt, therefore, that there is much to be done excuse me, to accelerate the development in many countries. Asian countries, even though they have made remarkable progress, still have many millions of their people vegetating in poverty. In actual fact, there are more poor people in India than the whole of Sub-Africa put together. There are at least about 500 million people in India who are living under $1 a day, even though India is making progress. It is also true that because of good leadership, millions are being moved out of poverty. China, in our lifetime, has witnessed the transformation of their country within a few decades, starting from the time of Deng Xiaoping to now, to this present President Xi Jinping, who has been in power since 2015 and has claimed that he is dedicated to making China one of the greatest countries in the world, but above all, of making poverty to disappear from China. I think we must call also on our leaders here to pledge to this nation and these people that in a period not too long from now, poverty would have departed from our own shores. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I know the attention span of most Nigerians is not long. So let me conclude. I hope the text of this lecture will be made available so that you can take them home and read. Let me conclude. In the course of this lecture, I've emphasized the role of political leadership in the affairs of states generally. This is more important in states in the developing world where leadership is critical to nation building, because most of these states are embryonic and they are in their formative stages. But even in old states, it is clear that their survival during crisis may be dependent on the emergence of a messianic figure like Winston Churchill or Charles de Gaulle. Nation building requires exemplary leadership, and leadership by example was demonstrated by Julius Nyerere, who lived a simple life as a president and who spent his entire life teaching his people moderation and dignity of hard labor. The same exemplary leadership and honesty can be seen in the life of Kenneth Kaunda, who, in spite of decades in power, has remained a modest man. Africa has had to contend with its multiplicity of tribes and ethnic groups within sovereign states. The only way to manage this plurality is fairness and respect for one another. This unfortunately has been absent in most African states. Kwame Nkrumah and Ahmed Sékou Touré managed to rule Ghana and Guinea respectively without recourse to ethnic exploitation. Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, through personal will and vision for a great nation, was able to rouse dormant Egyptian nation to rise and assert itself, and they have not looked back since then. In spite of the ups and downs that exist in normal nature of lives of nations, I have said again, nearer home, Obafemi Awolowo, through planning and deployment of resources, was able to bring free primary education to millions of his people, an example that was copied by his contemporaries in other parts of Nigeria. I happen to know this country very well. I wrote a biography of Sir Kashim Ibrahim, the former governor of the whole of northern Nigeria. When the coup in 1966 took place, Sir Kashim was taken to Maiduguri. He did not have a single house. In fact, he told me that it seemed as if he was asked to go to Maiduguri and die. He did not have a single house. There was no provision of pension. I used to meet in his house Ibrahim Biu, Alhaji Ibrahim Biu, who was his minister of education for several years. This old man used to ride around Maiduguri on bicycles. Why am I saying this? There is definitely a disconnect today between leadership and the led, and we need to look back into our history to connect again with what a leader is supposed to do for his people. It's not by building mansions. You build people. You build people. Awolowo has been dead for many years. Many of the people who went to his free primary education are also probably, many of them are dead. But his memory, lies in the fact that he touched the hearts of his people. Ahmadu Bello was the same. When Ahmadu Bello died, he didn't have a single house anywhere. Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, after he died, the federal government had to quickly build a house for his family in Bauchi. I'm recalling all this, that some of us who have lived through all these years can see a definite disconnect between what happened in the past and what is happening now. The work of building a nation cannot be done by one government or cannot be accomplished in one generation. What we must all look forward to is that our nations must not regress. One generation must build on the block put in place by another generation. There should be no room for tearing apart existing states. Rather, we must look for mergers and integration. This does not mean we must over-centralize the structure of government. As much as possible, we must give large measure of autonomy to various nationalities within each state so that groups can develop along and according to their own cultural pace without holding their compatriots back. We must also learn from subnationalism in other parts of the world and concede the fact that people want to keep much of their individual or group wealth to themselves rather than surrendering them to a distant authority. This does not mean selfish hoarding of resources. People in fact must share with less endowed regions and people. There must be a commitment to minimum national standard below which state and compatriots must not sink. The sit-tight syndrome, characteristic of many African countries, is also a malady and a cancer that must be cut out of our system. A situation in which a Robert Mugabe ruled Zimbabwe for 37 years must be avoided and deprecated and must not be repeated on the African continent. Countries like the Cameroons, Togo, Equatorial Guinea, Congo-Brazzaville, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Chad, Sudan, Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda should be told that one-man rule is no longer acceptable. This big man syndrome of African political system must be replaced by viable structures that do not depend